F-Zero was one of my favourite games as a kid. Up until F-Zero, the only way that you could experience these kind of graphics, speed and music were in the arcades. And I spent many a weekend on seaside piers pumping money into Daytona or virtual racing. So with F-Zero, I could now experience the fast-paced racing game in the comfort of my own living room. For those who don't know, F-Zero is a futuristic racing game originally developed by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and the game was released in Japan on November the 21st, 1990, then in North America in August 1991, and in Europe in 1992. It's the first game in the F-Zero series and arguably the most popular and iconic. It was a launch game alongside the SNES, and I got my hands on it in 1992 and was absolutely blown away. So there were 3 launch games: Super Mario World, Pilot Wings and F-Zero. Super Mario World was awesome, but there was something about the speed and the music in F-Zero that was something I hadn't seen before on a home console. Super Mario World was fantastic, don't get me wrong, but it was an iteration on Super Mario 3, a formula that we'd seen for some time. F-Zero, on the other hand, felt fresh, new, and it was something much closer to the games that we could play in the arcade. So back in 1992, there was a gulf between what you could play at home and what you could play in the arcades. It seems like a funny thought now, because as kids we used to go to the arcades and pay money for a few lives to have a time box go on an arcade machine. Graphics and the performance were much better in the arcades with Sega, Konami, Capcom and Neo Geo classics like Final Fight, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Daytona and X-Men. And at home we could only have 8-bit experiences with the NES or Master System. Getting back to F-Zero, as I mentioned before, it's set in the future and it's set in the year 2560, where a bunch of rich people have created a new sport based on Formula 1 called F-Zero. So you've got 4 characters in the game and each one had their own futuristic hover car. So we've got Captain Falcon, Dr. Stewart, Pico and Samurai Goro. And the player can race against computer-controlled characters in 15 tracks divided between 3 leagues. So in terms of development, as mentioned before, it was a launch title for the SNES and took Nintendo Entertainment Analysis and Development 15 months to complete. So F-Zero did have a sequel plan for the SNES, but it was cancelled and released through the Satellaview peripheral under the name of BS F-Zero Grand Prix. Takeya Imamura, who worked directly on F-Zero through its different incarnations, said in 2003 that having worked on the F-Zero series and seeing the results of the collaboration with Sega, I found myself at something of a loss to how we can take the franchise further past F-Zero GX and AX. So it is really interesting to know here that Nintendo collaborated with Sega on F-Zero and they later worked together on F-Zero GX. So at the time of the original F-Zero release, Nintendo and Sega were portrayed as bitter rivals in the console wars. So F-Zero was one of the first games to show off the Mode 7 graphics, and this graphical rendering technique was an innovative technological achievement at the time that made racing games much more realistic, and the first of which was F-Zero. F-Zero didn't really recapture the excitement and audience it had for the SNES version. Zero Racers G-Zero was a cancelled game for the Virtual Boy, and after a 7-year hiatus outside of Japan, the series made a transition to 3D with the 3rd installment F-Zero X on the Nintendo 64. And that game introduces 26 new vehicles, which also include the 4 from the original F-Zero game. The hardware limitations of Nintendo 64 resulted in the game running at 60 frames per second with 30 machines on the screen at the same time, but with little processor power left for graphical detail and music. Nintendo 64 Double D expansion, the F-Zero X expansion kit, was released in Japan as the last 64 Double D add-on disc for the system. The expansion kit added a course editor, a vehicle editor, 2 new cups, 3 new machines, and some new music too. The course editor was the main attraction for this expansion and was praised for its depth, as it was virtually the same program the game designers used to make the courses. F-Zero GX was released for the GameCube and developed by Sega's Amusement Vision team, and it's the first F-Zero game to feature a story mode. The game was initially titled F-Zero GC, and the arcade counterpart of GX was called F-Zero AX, which was released alongside Nintendo GameCube counterpart in mid-2003. The game had 3 types of arcade cabinets: Standard, the Monster Ride and the Deluxe, which resembled an F-Zero vehicle. F-Zero AX had 6 original courses, 10 original characters. However, the 6 courses and 10 characters could also be unlocked in F-Zero GX. There were also iterations of F-Zero on the Game Boy Advance, with F-Zero Maximum Velocity, which was also a launch title and went back to the Mode 7 gameplay of the SNES. F-Zero GP Legend is a second handheld game released for the Game Boy Advance, and the second installment featuring a story mode. This one is based on the anime series of the same name, including a new character named Ryo Suzaka and Rick Wheeler. The final F-Zero game was F-Zero Climax, and was released in Japan for the Game Boy Advance on October the 21st, 2004. And like its handheld predecessor, F-Zero GP Legend, Climax was published by Nintendo and developed by both them and Suzak. This was the first F-Zero game to have a built-in track editor without the need for an expansion or add-on. So critics agreed that F-Zero was one of the best racing games of its generation and also set the standard for the futuristic subgenre. You can certainly see a lot of F-Zero inspiration in Wipeout for the original PlayStation, but the one drawback the critics tend to agree on when looking back is that it could really have done with a multiplayer mode. The fact that players could only play against the computer AI really limited the lifespan of the game. Looking a bit closer at the feedback from critics, F-Zero was widely lauded for its graphical realism, as it's been called the fastest and most fluid pseudo-3D racing game of its time. So Jeremy Parish of Electronic Gaming Monthly wrote that the game's use of Mode 7 created the most convincing racetracks that had ever been seen on home console, that gave console gamers an experience even more visceral than could be found in the arcades. Also, we've got one-up editor Ravi Hiranand agreed, arguing that F-Zero's combination of fast-paced racing and free range of motion was superior compared to that of previous home console games, and IGN's Piers Schneider assured readers that F-Zero was one of the few 16-bit era games to perfectly combine presentation, functionality to create a completely new gaming experience. And if you want to check out F-Zero these days, it's really easy to do so through the Super Nintendo Entertainment System online for Nintendo Switch, or on the SNES Classic. So if you are a Switch Online subscriber, then you have it for free, and it's well worth checking it out. Well, that is it for my short history of F-Zero. Absolutely love that game, and I really enjoyed going back for research for this history of project.